Part 2 of The Stars, My Brothers by Edmond Hamilton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Greg Marguerite. The Stars, My Brothers by Edmond Hamilton. Section 5. It was nothing like landing in a rocket. First there was the business referred to as going out of drive. Paula made Kieran strap in, and she said, "You may find this unpleasant, but just sit tight, it doesn't last long." Kieran sat stiff and glowering, prepared for anything, and determined not to show it no matter how he felt. Then Weber did something to the control board, and the universe fell apart. Kieran's stomach came up and stuck in his throat. He was falling, up, down, sideways. He didn't know. But whichever it was, not all the parts of him were falling at the same rate. Or perhaps it was not all in the same direction. He didn't know that either. But it was an exceptionally hideous feeling. He opened his mouth to protest, and all of a sudden he was sitting normally in the chair in the normal cabin and screaming at the top of his lungs. He shut up. Paula said, "I told you it would be unpleasant." "So you did," said Kieran. He sat sweating. His hands and feet were cold. Now for the first time he became aware of motion. The flitter seemed to hurtle forward at comet-like speed. Kieran knew that this was merely an ironic little joke, because now they were proceeding at something in the range of normal velocity, whereas before their speed had been quite beyond his comprehension. But he could comprehend this. He could feel it. They were going like a bat out of hell, and somewhere ahead of them was a planet, and he was closed in, blind, a mouse in a nose cone. His insides writhed with helplessness and the imminence of a crash. He wanted very much to start screaming again, but Paula was watching him. In a few moments that desire became academic. A whistling shriek began faintly outside the hull and built swiftly to a point where nothing could have been heard above it. Atmosphere. And somewhere under the blind wall of the flitter a rock-hard world face, reeling and rushing, leaping to meet them. The flitter slowed. It seemed to hang motionless, quivering faintly. Then it dropped. Express elevator to the world's tallest building, top to bottom. Only the elevator is a bubble, and the wind is tossing it from side to side as it drops, and there is no bottom. They hung again, bounding lightly on the unseen wind, then down, and hang again, and down. Paula said suddenly, Weber, I think he's dying." She began to unstrap. Kieran said faintly, "Am I turning green?" She looked at him, frowning. "Yes." "A simple old malady. I'm seasick. Tell Weber to quit playing hummingbird and put this thing down." Paula made an impatient gesture and tightened her belt again. Hang and drop, once more, twice more. A little rocking bounce, a light thump. Motion ceased. Weber turned a series of switches. Silence. Kieran said, "Air?" Weber opened a hatch in the side of the cabin. Light poured in. It had to be sunlight, Kieran knew, but it was a queer color, a sort of tawny orange that carried a pleasantly burning heat. He got loose with Paula helping him and tottered to the hatch. The air smelled of clean, sun-warmed dust and some kind of vegetation. Kieran climbed out of the flitter, practically throwing himself out in his haste. He wanted solid ground under him. He didn't care whose or where. And as his boots thumped onto the red ochre sand, it occurred to him that it had been a very long time since he had had solid ground underfoot. A very long time indeed. His insides knotted up again, and this time it was not seasickness but fear. And he was cold all through again, in spite of the hot new sun. He was afraid, not of the present nor of the future, but of the past. He was afraid of the thing tagged Reed Kieran, the stiff, blind, voiceless thing wheeling its slow orbit around the moon, companion to dead worlds and dead space, brother to the cold and the dark. He began to tremble. Paula shook him. She was talking, but he couldn't hear her. He could only hear the rush of eternal darkness past his ears, the thin squeak of his shadow brushing across the stars. Weber's face was somewhere above him, looking angry and disgusted. He was talking to Paula, shaking his head. They were far away. Kieran was losing them, drifting away from them on the black tide. Then suddenly there was something like an explosion, a crimson flare across the black, a burst of heat against the cold. Shocked and wild, the physical part of him clawed back to reality. Something hurt him, Something threatened him. He put his hand to his cheek and it came away red. Paula and Webber were yanking at him, trying to get him to move. A stone whizzed past his head. It struck the side of the flitter with a sharp clack and fell. Kieran's nervous relays finally connected. He jumped for the open hatch. Automatically he pushed Paula ahead of him, trying to shield her, and she gave him an odd, startled look. Webber was already inside. More stones rattled around, and one grazed Kieran's thigh. It hurt. His cheek was bleeding freely. He rolled inside the flitter and turned to look back out the hatch. He was mad. "Who's doing it?" he demanded. Paula pointed. At first Kieran was distracted by the strangeness of the landscape. The flitter crouched in a vastness of red ochre sand laced with some low-growing plant that shone like metallic gold in the sunlight. The sand receded in tilted planes, lifting gradually to a range of mountains on the right, and dropping gradually to infinity on the left. Directly in front of the flitter, and quite literally a stone's throw away, was the beginning of a thick belt of trees that grew beside a river, apparently quite a wide one, though he could not see much but a tawny sparkling of water. The course of the river could be traced clear back to the mountains by the winding line of woods that followed its bed. The trees themselves were not like any Kieran had seen before. There seemed to be several varieties, all grotesque in shape and exotic in color. There were even some green ones with long, sharp leaves that looked like spearheads. Exotic or not, they made perfectly adequate cover. Stones came whistling out of the woods, but Kieran could not see anything where Paula was pointing but an occasional shaking of foliage. "Sake?" he asked. Webber snorted. "You'll know it when the Sake find us. They don't throw stones." "These are the humans," Paula said. There was an indulgent softness in her voice that irritated Kieran. "I thought they were our dear little friends," he said. "You frightened them." "I frightened them?" "They've seen the flitter before, but they're extremely alert to modes of behavior, and they knew you weren't acting right. They thought you were sick. So they tried to kill me. Nice fellows." "Self-preservation," Webber said. "They can't afford the luxury of too much kindness." "They're very kind among themselves," Paula said defensively to Kieran. She added, "I doubt if they were trying to kill you. They just wanted to drive you away." "Oh, well," said Kieran, "in that case I wouldn't dream of disappointing them. Let's go." Paula glared at him and turned to Webber. "Talk to them." "I hope there's time," Webber grunted, glancing at the sky. "We're sitting ducks here. Keep your patient quiet. Any more of that moaning and flopping and we're sunk." He picked up a large plastic container and moved closer to the door. Paula looked at Kieran's cheek. "Let me fix that." "Don't bother," he said. At this moment he hoped the Sake, whoever and whatever they were, would come along and clap these two into some suitable place for the rest of their lives. Webber began to talk. Kieran stared at him, fascinated. He had expected words. Primitive words, perhaps resembling the click speech of Earth's Stone Age survivals, but words of some sort. Webber hooted. It was a soft, reassuring sound, repeated over and over, but it was not a word. The rattling of stones diminished, then stopped. Webber continued to make his hooting call. Presently it was answered. Webber turned and nodded at Paula, smiling. He reached into the plastic container and drew forth a handful of brownish objects that smelled to Kieran like dried fruit. Webber tossed these out onto the sand. Now he made a different sound, a grunting and wuffling. There was silence. Webber made the sound again. On the third try, the people came out of the woods. In all there were perhaps 25 of them. They came slowly and furtively, moving a step or two at a time, then halting and peering, prepared to run. The able-bodied men came first, with one in the lead, a fine-looking chap in early middle age who was apparently the chief. The women, the old men, and the children followed, trickling gradually out of the shadow of the trees, but remaining where they could disappear in a flash if alarmed. They were all perfectly naked, tall and slender and large-eyed, their muscles strung for speed and agility rather than massive strength. Their bodies gleamed a light bronze color in the sun, and Kieran noticed that the men were beardless and smooth-skinned. Both men and women had long hair, ranging in color from black to tawny, and very clean and glistening. They were a beautiful people, as deer are a beautiful people, graceful, innocent, and wild. The men came up to the dried fruits which had been scattered for them. They picked them up and sniffed them, bit them, then began to eat, repeating the grunt and waffle call. The women and children and old men decided everything was safe and joined them. Webber tossed out more fruit and then got out himself, carrying the plastic box. "What does he do next?" whispered Kieran to Paula. "Scratch their ears? I used to tame squirrels this way when I was a kid." "Shut up," she warned him. Webber beckoned and she nudged him to move out of the flitter, slow and careful. Kieran slid out of the flitter. Big glistening eyes swung to watch him. The eating stopped. Some of the little ones scuttled for the trees. Kieran froze. Webber hooted and wuffled some more, and the tension relaxed. Kieran approached the group with Paula. There was suddenly no truth in what he was doing. He was an actor in a bad scene, mingling with impossible characters in an improbable setting. Webber making ridiculous noises and tossing his dried fruit around like a caricature of somebody sewing. Paula with her brisk professionalism all dissolved in misty-eyed fondness. Himself an alien in this time and place, and these perfectly normal-appearing people behaving like orangutans with their fur shaved off. He started to laugh and then thought better of it. Once started, he might not be able to stop. "Let them get used to you," Webber said softly. Paula obviously had been here before. She had begun to make noises too, a modified hooting, more like a pigeon's call. Kieran just stood still. The people moved in around them, sniffing, touching. There was no conversation, no laughing or giggling, even among the little girls. A particularly beautiful young woman stood just behind the chief, watching the strangers with big yellow cat eyes. Kieran took her to be the man's daughter. He smiled at her. She continued to stare, deadpanned and blank-eyed, with no answering flicker of a smile. It was as though she had never seen one before. Kieran shivered. All this silence and unresponsiveness became eerie. "I'm happy to tell you," he muttered to Paula, "that I don't think much of your little pets." She could not allow herself to be sharply angry. She only said in a whisper, "They are not pets. They are not animals. They—" She broke off. Something had come over the naked people. Every head had lifted, every eye had turned away from the strangers. They were listening. Even the little ones were still. Kieran could not hear anything except the wind in the trees. "What?" he started to ask. Webber made an imperative gesture for silence. The tableau held for a brief second longer. Then the brown-haired man, who seemed to be the leader, made a short, harsh noise. The people turned and vanished into the trees. "The sake," Webber said. "Get out of sight." He ran toward the flitter. Paula grabbed Kieran's sleeve and pushed him towards the trees. "What's going on?" he demanded as he ran. "Their ears are better than ours. There's a patrol ship coming, I think." The shadows took them in. Orange and gold-splashed shadows under strange trees. Kieran looked back. Webber had been inside the flitter. Now he tumbled out of the hatch and ran towards them. Behind him the hatch closed and the flitter stirred and then took off all by itself, humming. "They'll follow it for a while," Webber panted. "It may give us a chance to get away." He and Paula started after the running people. Kieran balked. "I don't know why I'm running away from anybody." Webber pulled out a snub-nosed instrument that looked enough like a gun to be very convincing. He pointed it at Kieran's middle. "Reason 1," he said. "If the sake catch Paula and me here, we're in very big trouble. Reason 2, this is a closed area, and you're with us, so you will be in very big trouble." He looked coldly at Kieran. "The first reason is the one that interests me most." Kieran shrugged. "Well, now I know." He ran. Only then did he hear the low, heavy thrumming in the sky. Section 6. The sound came rumbling very swiftly toward them. It was a completely different sound from the humming of the flitter, and it seemed to Kieran to hold a note of menace. He stopped in a small clearing where he might see up through the trees. He wanted to look at this ship or flyer or whatever it was that had been built and was flown by non-humans. But Webber shoved him roughly into a clump of squat trees that were the color of sherry wine, with flat, thick leaves. "Don't move," he said. Paula was hugging a tree beside him. She nodded to him to do as Webber said. "They have very powerful scanners." She pointed with her chin. "Look, they've learned." The harsh warning barks of the men sounded faintly. Then they were hushed. Nothing moved except the natural motion of the wind. The people crouched among the trees, so still that Kieran would not have seen them if he had not known they were there. The patrol craft roared past, cranking up speed as it went. Webber grinned. "There'll be a couple of hours at least overhauling and examining the flitter. By that time it'll be dark, and by morning we'll be in the mountains." The people were already moving. They headed upstream, going at a steady shuffling trot. 3 of the women, Kieran noticed, had babies in their arms. The older children ran beside their mothers. 2 of the men and several of the women were white-haired. They also ran. "Do you like to see them run?" asked Paula, with a sharp note of passion in her voice. "Does it look good to you?" "No," said Kieran, frowning. He looked in the direction in which the sound of the patrol craft was vanishing. "Move along," Webber said. "They'll leave us far enough behind as it is." Kieran followed the naked people through the woods, beside the tawny river. Paula and Webber jogged beside him. The shadows were long now, reaching out across the water. Paula kept glancing at him anxiously, as though to detect any sign of weakness on his part. "You're doing fine," she said. "You should. Your body was brought back to normal strength and tone before you were ever awakened." "They'll slow down when it's dark anyway," said Webber. The old people and the little children ran strongly. "Is their village there?" Kieran asked, indicating the distant mountains. "They don't live in villages," Paula said, "but the mountains are safer, more places to hide." "You said this was a closed area. What is it, a hunting preserve?" "The Sakae don't hunt them anymore." "But they used to?" "Well," Webber said, "a long time ago. Not for food. The Sakae are vegetarians, but—" "But," said Paula, "they were the dominant race, and the people were simply beasts of the field. When they competed for the land and food, the people were hunted down or driven out." She swung an expressive hand toward the landscape beyond the trees. "Why do you think they live in this desert, scraping a miserable existence along the watercourses? It's land the Sakae didn't want. Now, of course, they have no objections to setting it aside as a sort of game preserve. The humans are protected, the Sakae tell us. They're living their natural life in their natural environment. And when we demand that a program be—" She was out of breath and had to stop, panting. Webber finished for her. "We want them taught, lifted out of this naked savagery. The Sakae say it's impossible." "Is it true?" asked Kieran. "No," said Paula fiercely. "It's a matter of pride. They want to keep their dominance, so they simply won't admit that the people are anything more than animals. And they won't give them a chance to be anything more." There was no more talking after that, but even so, the 3 outlanders grew more and more winded, and the people gained on them. The sun went down in a blaze of blood orange light that tinted the trees in even more impossible colors and set the river briefly on fire. Then night came, and just after the darkness shut down, the patrol craft returned, beating up along the winding river bed. Kieran froze under the black trees, and the hair lifted on his skin. For the first time he felt like a hunted thing. For the first time he felt a personal anger. The patrol craft drummed away and vanished. "They won't come back until daylight," Webber said. He handed out little flat packets of concentrated food from his pockets. They munched as they walked. Nobody said anything. The wind, which had dropped at sundown, picked up from a different quarter and began to blow again. It got cold. After a while they caught up with the people, who had stopped to rest and eat. The babies and old people, for whom Kieran had felt a worried pity, were in much better shape than he. He drank from the river and then sat down. Paula and Webber sat beside him on the ground. The wind blew hard from the desert, dry and chill. The trees thrashed overhead. Against the pale glimmer of the water, Kieran could see naked bodies moving along the river's edge, wading, bending, grubbing in the mud. Apparently they found things, for he could see that they were eating. Somewhere close by, other people were stripping fruit or nuts from the trees. A man picked up a stone and pounded something with a cracking noise, then dropped the stone again. They moved easily in the dark, as though they were used to it. Kieran recognized the leader's yellow-eyed daughter, her beautiful slender height outlined against the pale gleaming water. She stood up to her ankles in the soft mud, holding something tight in her 2 hands, eating. The sweat dried on Kieran. He began to shiver. "You're sure that patrol ship won't come back?" he asked. "Not until they can see what they're looking for." "Then I guess it's safe." He began to scramble around, feeling for dried sticks. "What are you doing?" "Getting some firewood." "No!" Paula was beside him in an instant, her hand on his arm. "No, you mustn't do that." "But Webber said—" "It isn't the patrol ship, Kieran. It's the people. They—" "They what?" "I told you they were low on the social scale. This is one of the basic things that they have to be taught. Right now they still regard fire as a danger, something to run from." "I see," Kieran said, and let the kindling fall. "Very well. If I can't have a fire, I'll have you. Your body will warm me." He pulled her into his arms. She gasped, more in astonishment, he thought, than alarm. "What are you talking about?" "That's a line from an old movie. From a number of old movies, in fact. Not bad, eh?" He held her tight. She was definitely female. After a moment he pushed her away. "That was a mistake. I want to be able to go on disliking you without any qualifying considerations." She laughed, a curiously flat little sound. "Was everybody crazy in your day?" she asked, and then, "Reed?" It was the first time she had used his given name. "What?" "When they threw stones, and we got back into the flitter, you pushed me ahead of you. You were guarding me. Why?" He stared at her, or rather at the pale blur of her standing close to him. "Well, it's always been sort of the custom for the men to... But now that I think of it, Webber didn't bother." "No," said Paula. "Back in your day, women were still taking advantage of the dual standard, demanding complete equality with men, but clinging to their special status. We've got beyond that." "Do you like it? Beyond, I mean?" "Yes," she said. "It was good of you to do that, but..." Webber said, "They're moving again. Come on." The people walked this time, strung out in a long line between the trees and the water, where the light was a little better and the way more open. The three outlanders tagged behind, clumsy in their boots and clothing. The long hair of the people blew in the wind, and their bare feet padded softly, light and swift. Kieran looked up at the sky. The trees obscured much of it, so that all he could see was some scattered stars overhead, but he thought that somewhere a moon was rising. He asked Paula, and she said, "Wait, you'll see." Night and the river rolled behind them. The moonlight became brighter, but it was not at all like the moonlight Kieran remembered from long ago and far away. That had a cold tranquility to it, but this light was neither cold nor tranquil. It seemed somehow to shift color, too, which made it even less adequate for seeing than the white moonlight he was used to. Sometimes, as it filtered through the trees, it seemed ice green, and again it was reddish or amber or blue. They came to a place where the river made a wide bend, and they cut across it, clear of the trees. Paula touched Kieran's arm and pointed. "Look." Kieran looked, and then he stopped still. The light was not moonlight, and its source was not a moon. It was a globular cluster of stars, hung in the sky like a swarm of fiery bees, a burning and pulsing of many colors, diamond white and gold, green and crimson, peacock blue and smoky umber. Kieran stared, and beside him Paula murmured, "I've been on a lot of planets, but none of them have anything like this." The people moved swiftly on, paying no attention at all to the sky. Reluctantly, Kieran followed them into the obscuring woods. He kept looking at the open sky above the river, waiting for the cluster to rise high so he could see it. It was some time after this, but before the cluster rose clear of the trees, that Kieran got the feeling that something or someone was following them. Section 7. He had stopped to catch his breath and shake an accumulation of sand out of his boots. He was leaning against a tree with his back to the wind, which meant that he was facing their back trail, and he thought he saw a shadow move where there was nothing to cast a shadow. He straightened up, with the little trip hammers of alarm beating all over him, but he could see nothing more. He thought he might have been mistaken. Just the same, he ran to catch up with the others. The people were moving steadily. Kieran knew that their senses were far keener than his, and they were obviously not aware of any danger other than the basic one of the sake. He decided that he must have been seeing things, but an uneasiness persisted. He dropped behind again, this time on purpose, after they had passed a clearing. He stayed hidden behind a tree trunk and watched. The cluster light was bright now, but very confusing to the eye. He heard a rustling that he did not think was wind, and he thought that something started to cross the clearing and then stopped, as though it had caught his scent. Then he thought that he heard rustling at both sides of the clearing, stealthy sounds of stalking that closed in towards him. Only the wind, he told himself, but again he turned to run. This time he met Paula coming back to look for him. "Reed, are you all right?" she asked. He caught her arm and pulled her around and made her run. "What is it? What's the matter?" "I don't know." He hurried with her until he could see Webber ahead, and beyond them the bare backs and blowing hair of the people. "Listen," he said, "are there any predators here?" "Yes," Paula said, and Webber turned sharply around. "Have you seen something?" "I don't know. I thought I did. I'm not sure." "Where?" "Behind us." Webber made the harsh, barking danger call, and the people stopped. Webber stood looking back the way they had come. The women caught the children, and the men fell back to where Webber stood. They looked and listened, sniffing the air. Kieran listened too, but now he did not hear any rustlings except the high thrashing of the branches. Nothing stirred visibly, and the wind would carry away any warning scent. The men turned away. The people moved on again. Webber shrugged. "You must have been mistaken, Kieran." "Maybe. Or maybe they just can't think beyond the elementary. If they don't smell it, it isn't there. If something is after us, it's coming upwind, the way any hunting animal works. A couple of the men ought to circle around and—" "Come on," said Webber wearily. They followed the people beside the river. The cluster was high now, a hive of suns reflected in the flowing water, a kaleidoscopic rippling of colors. Now the women were carrying the smaller children. The ones too large to be carried were lagging behind a little. So were the aged. Not much yet. Kieran, conscious that he was weaker than the weakest of these, looked ahead at the dim bulk of the mountains and thought that they ought to be able to make it. He was not at all sure that he would. The river made another bend. The trail lay across the bend, clear of the trees. It was a wide bend, perhaps 2 miles across the neck. Ahead, where the trail joined the river again, there was a rocky hill. Something about the outlines of the hill seemed wrong to Kieran, but it was too far away to be sure of anything. Overhead, the cluster burned gloriously. The people set out across the sand. Webber looked back. "You see," he said. "Nothing." They went on. Kieran was beginning to feel very tired now. All the artificial strength that had been pumped into him before his awakening was running out. Webber and Paula walked with their heads down, striding determinedly, but without joy. "What do you think now?" she asked Kieran. "Is this any way for humans to live?" The ragged line of women and children moved ahead of them, with the men in the lead. It was not natural, Kieran thought, for children to be able to travel so far. And then he remembered that the young of non-predaceous species have to be strong and fleet at an early age. Suddenly one of the women made a harsh, shrill cry. Kieran looked where she was looking, off to the left, to the river and the curving line of trees. A large black shadow slipped across the sand. He looked behind him. There were other shadows, coming with long, easy bounds out of the trees, fanning out in a shallow crescent. They reminded Kieran of some animal he had once seen in a zoo, a partly cat-like, partly dog-like beast. A cheetah, he thought it had been called, only the cheetah was spotted like a leopard, and these creatures were black with stiff, upstanding ears. They bayed, and the coursing began. "Nothing," said Kieran bitterly. "I count 7. Webber said, "My God, The people ran. They tried to break back to the river and the trees that could be climbed to safety, but the hunters turned them. Then they fled blindly forward, toward the hill. They ran with all their strength, making no sound. Kieran and Webber ran with them, with Paula between them. Webber seemed absolutely appalled. "Where's that gun you had?" Kieran panted. "It's not a gun, it's only a short-range shocker," he said. "It wouldn't stop these things. Look at them." They bounded, sporting around them, howling with a sound like laughter. They were as large as leopards, and their eyes glowed in the cluster light. They seemed to be enjoying themselves, as though hunting was the most delightful game in the world. One of them ran up to within 2 feet of Kieran and snapped at him with its great jaws, dodging agilely when he raised his arm. They drove the people faster and faster. At first the men had formed around the women and children, but the formation began to disintegrate as the weaker ones dropped behind, and no attempt was made to keep it. Panic was stronger than instinct now. Kieran looked ahead. "If we can make it to that hill—" Paula screamed, and he stumbled over a child, a girl about 5, crawling on her hands and knees. He picked her up. She bit and thrashed and tore at him, her bare little body hard as whalebone and slippery with sweat. He could not hold on to her. She kicked herself free of his hands and rushed wildly out of reach, and one of the black hunters pounced in and bore her away, shrieking thinly like a fledgling bird in the jaws of a cat. "Oh, my God," said Paula, and covered her head with her arms, trying to shut out sight and sound. He caught her and said harshly, "Don't faint, because I can't carry you." The child's mother, whichever of the women it might have been, did not look back. An old woman who strayed aside was pulled down and dragged off, and then one of the white-haired men. The hill was closer. Kieran saw now what was wrong with it. Part of it was a building. He was too tired and too sick to be interested, except as it offered a refuge. He spoke to Webber with great difficulty because he was winded, and then he realized that Webber wasn't there. Webber had stumbled and fallen. He had started to get up, but the hunters were on him. He was on his hands and knees facing them, screaming at them to get away from him. He had obviously had little or no experience with raw violence. Kieran ran back to him, with Paula close behind. "Use your gun!" he yelled. He was afraid of the Black Hunters, but he was full of rage, and the rage outweighed the fear. He yelled at them, cursing them. He hurled sand into their eyes, and one that was creeping up on Webber from the side he kicked. The creature drew off a little, not frightened but surprised. They were not used to this sort of thing from humans. "Your gun!" Kieran roared again, and Webber pulled the snub-nosed thing out of his pocket. He stood up and said unsteadily, "I told you it's not a gun. It won't kill anything. I don't think—" "Use it," said Kieran, "and get moving again, slowly." They started to move, and then across the sky a great iron voice spoke like thunder. "Lie down," it said. "Please, lie down flat." Kieran turned his head, startled. From the direction of the building on the hill, a vehicle was speeding toward them. "The Sakae," said Webber, with what was almost a sob of relief. "Lie down." As he did so, Kieran saw a pale flash shoot out from the vehicle and knock over a hunter still hanging on the flanks of the fleeing people. He hugged the sand. Something went whining and whistling over him. There was a thunk and a screech. It was repeated, and then the iron voice spoke again. "You may get up now. Please remain where you are." The vehicle was much closer. They were bathed in sudden light. The voice said, "Mr. Webber, you are holding a weapon. Please drop it." "It's only a little shocker," Webber said plaintively. He dropped it. The vehicle had wide tracks that threw up clouds of sand. It came clanking to a halt. Kieran, shading his eyes, thought he distinguished two creatures inside, a driver and a passenger. The passenger emerged, climbing with some difficulty over the steep step of the track, his tail rattling down behind him like a length of thick cable. Once on the ground he became quite agile, moving with a sort of oddly graceful prance on his powerful legs. He approached, his attention centered on Kieran, but he observed the amenities, placing one delicate hand on his breast and making a slight bow. "Dr. Ray." His muzzle, shaped something like a duck's bill, nevertheless formed Paula's name tolerably well. "And you, I think, are Mr. Kieran." Kieran said, "Yes." The star cluster blazed overhead, the dead beasts lay behind him, the people with their flying hair had run on beyond his sight. He had been dead for 100 years and now was alive again. Now he was standing on alien soil, facing an alien form of life, communicating with it, and he was so dog-tired and every sensory nerve was so thoroughly flayed that he had nothing left to react with. He simply looked at the Sakae as he might have looked at a fence post and said, "Yes." The Sakae made his formal little bow again. "I am Bregg." He shook his head. "I'm glad I was able to reach you in time. You people don't seem to have any notion of the amount of trouble you make for us." Paula, who had not spoken since the child was carried off, suddenly screamed at Bregg. "Murderer!" She sprang at him, striking him in blind hysteria. Section 8. Bregg sighed. He caught Paula in those fine small hands that seemed to have amazing strength and held her at arm's length. "Dr. Ray," he said. He shook her. "Dr. Ray!" She stopped screaming. "I don't wish to administer a sedative, because then you will say that I drugged you. But I will if I must." Kieran said, "I'll keep her quiet." He took her from Bregg. She collapsed against him and began to cry. "Murderers," she whispered. "That little girl, those old people." Webber said, "You could exterminate those beasts. You don't have to let them hunt the people like that. It's... "Unhuman is the word you want," said Bregg. His voice was exceedingly weary. "Please get into the car." They climbed in. The car churned around and sped back toward the building. Paula shivered and Kieran held her in his arms. Webber said after a moment or two, "How did you happen to be here, Bregg?" "When we caught the flitter and found it empty, it was obvious that you were here with the people, and it became imperative to find you before you came to harm. I remembered that the trail ran close by this old outpost building, so I had the patrol ship drop us here with an emergency vehicle." Kieran said, "You knew the people were coming this way?" "Of course." Bregg sounded surprised. "They migrate every year at the beginning of the dry season. How do you suppose Webber found them so easily?" Kieran looked at Webber. He asked, "Then they weren't running from the Sakae?" "Of course they were," Paula said. "You saw them yourself, cowering under the trees when the ship went over." "The patrol ships frighten them," Bregg said, "sometimes to the point of stampeding them, which is why we use them only in emergencies. The people do not connect the ships with us." "That," said Paula flatly, "is a lie." Bregg sighed. Enthusiasts always believe what they want to believe. Come and see for yourself." She straightened up. "What have you done to them?" "We've caught them in a trap," said Bregg, "and we are presently going to stick needles into them. A procedure necessitated by your presence, Dr. Ray. They're highly susceptible to imported viruses, as you should remember. One of your little parties of do-gooders succeeded in wiping out a whole band of them not too many years ago. So, inoculations and quarantine." Lights had blazed up in the area near the building. The car sped toward them. Kieran said slowly, "Why don't you just exterminate the hunters and have done with them?" "In your day, Mr. Kieran, yes, I've heard all about you. In your day, did you on Earth exterminate the predators so that their natural prey might live more happily?" Bregg's long muzzle and sloping skull were profiled against the lights. "No," said Kieran, "we didn't. But in that case, they were all animals." "Exactly," said Bregg. "No, wait, Dr. Ray. Spare me the lecture. I can give you a much better reason than that. One even you can't quarrel with. It's a matter of ecology. The number of humans destroyed by these predators annually is negligible, but they do themselves destroy an enormous number of small creatures with which the humans compete for their food. If we exterminated the hunters, the small animals would multiply so rapidly that the humans would starve to death." The car stopped beside the hill at the edge of the lighted area. A sort of makeshift corral of wire fencing had been set up, with wide wings to funnel the people into the enclosure, where a gate was shut on them. Two Sakae were mounting guard as the party from the car approached the corral. Inside the fence, Kieran could see the people, flopped around in positions of exhaustion. They did not seem to be afraid now. A few of them were drinking from a supply of water provided for them. There was food scattered for them on the ground. Bregg said something in his own language to one of the guards, who looked surprised and questioned him, then departed, springing strongly on his powerful legs. "Wait," said Bregg. They waited, and in a moment or two the guard came back, leading one of the black hunting beasts on a chain. It was a female, somewhat smaller than the ones Kieran had fought with, and having a slash of white on the throat and chest. She howled and sprang up on Bregg, butting her great head into his shoulder, wriggling with delight. He petted her, talking to her, and she laughed, dog-like, and licked his cheek. "They domesticate well," he said. "We've had a tame breed for centuries." He moved a little closer to the corral, holding tight to the animal's chain. Suddenly she became aware of the people. Instantly the good-natured pet turned into a snarling fury. She reared on her hind legs and screamed, and inside the corral the people roused up. They were not frightened now. They spat and chattered, clawing up sand and pebbles and bits of food to throw through the fence. Bregg handed the chain to the guard, who hauled the animal away by main force. Paula said coldly, "If your point was that the people are not kind to animals, my answer is that you can hardly blame them." "A year ago," Bregg said, "some of the people got hold of her two young ones. They were torn to pieces before they could be saved, and she saw it. I can't blame her either." He went on to the gate and opened it and went inside. The people drew back from him. They spat at him too, and pelted him with food and pebbles. He spoke to them sternly, in the tone of one speaking to unruly dogs, and he spoke words in his own tongue. The people began to shuffle about uneasily. They stopped throwing things. He stood waiting. The yellow-eyed girl came sidling forward and rubbed herself against his thigh, head, shoulder, and flank. He reached down and stroked her, and she whimpered with pleasure and arched her back. "Oh, for God's sake," said Kieran, "let's get out of here." Later they sat wearily on fallen blocks of cement inside a dusty, shadowy room of the old building. Only a hand lamp dispelled the gloom, and the wind whispered coldly, and Bregg walked to and fro in his curious prance as he talked. "It will be a little while before the necessary medical team can be picked up and brought here," he said. "We shall have to wait." "And then?" asked Kieran. "First to—" Bregg used a word that undoubtedly named a city of the Sakae, but that meant nothing to Kieran. "And then to Altair too. This, of course, is a council matter." He stopped and looked with bright, shrewd eyes at Kieran. "You are quite the sensation already, Mr. Kieran. The whole community of Starworlds is already aware of the illegal resuscitation of one of the pioneer spacemen, and of course there is great interest." He paused. "You yourself have done nothing unlawful. You cannot very well be sent back to sleep, and undoubtedly the council will want to hear you. I am curious as to what you will say." "About Sako?" said Kieran. "About them?" He made a gesture toward a window through which the wind brought the sound of stirring, of the gruntings and wufflings of the corralled people. "Yes, about them." "I'll tell you how I feel," Kieran said flatly. He saw Paula and Webber lean forward in the shadows. "I'm a human man. The people out there may be savage, low as the beasts, good for nothing the way they are, but they're human. You Sakai may be intelligent, civilized, reasonable, but you're not human. When I see you ordering them around like beasts, I want to kill you. That's how I feel." Bregg did not change his bearing, but he made a small sound that was almost a sigh. "Yes," he said. "I feared it would be so. A man of your times, a man from a world where humans were all dominant, would feel that way." He turned and looked at Paula and Webber. "It appears that your scheme to this extent was successful." "No, I wouldn't say that," said Kieran. Paula stood up. "But you just told us how you feel." "And it's the truth," said Kieran, "but there's something else." He looked thoughtfully at her. "It was a good idea. It was bound to work. A man of my time was bound to feel just the way you wanted him to feel, and would go away from here crying your party slogans and believing them. But you overlooked something." He paused, looking out the window into the sky at the faint vari-colored radiance of the cluster. "You overlooked the fact that when you awoke me, I would no longer be a man of my own time, or of any time. I was in darkness for 100 years, with the stars, my brothers, and no man touching me. Maybe that chills a man's feelings. Maybe something deep in his mind lives and has time to think. I've told you how I feel, yes, but I haven't told you what I think." He stopped again, then said, "The people out there in the corral have my form, and my instinctive loyalty is to them. But instinct isn't enough. It would have kept us in the mud of Earth forever if it could. Reason took us out to the wider universe. Instinct tells me that those out there are my people. Reason tells me that you," he looked at Bregg, "who are abhorrent to me, who would make my skin creep if I touched you, you who go by reason, that you are my real people. Instinct made a hell of Earth for millennia. I say we ought to leave it behind us there in the mud, and not let it make a hell of the stars. For you'll run into this same problem over and over again as you go out into the wider universe, and the old parochial human loyalties must be altered to solve it." He looked at Paula and said, "I'm sorry, but if anyone asks me, that is what I'll say." "I'm sorry too," she said, rage and dejection ringing in her voice. "Sorry we woke you. I hope I never see you again." Kieran shrugged. "After all, you did wake me. You're responsible for me. Here I am, facing a whole new universe, and I'll need you." He went over and patted her shoulder. "Damn you," she said, but she did not move away from him. End of Part 2 of The Stars, My Brothers by Edmond Hamilton.